Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about disorders of motor function, and we're going to go over a little anatomy before we get into the pathophysiology of all of this. And so you remember the motor cortex, and the motor cortex is the highest level or the highest controlling level of motor function. It's controlled by the primary, the premotor, and the supplementary motor cortices, and these are in the frontal lobe. So if you look here, you have the central sulcus, and that divides your motor region from your somatosensory region. And so you have area 4, 6, and 8, and these are your motor and your premotor, and then your supplementary regions of the motor cortex. We're going to talk about the thalamus, which is located in this region here, and then deeper to the thalamus is the basal ganglia, and we're going to talk about how they all work with the motor cortex. And then also, although it's not really showing here, it should be sitting right about here, we have the cerebellum, and that also is helping with the function. So we're going to go over each of these in detail and then how they are affected in different disease states. The motor cortex is helping us with precise, skillful, and intentional movements, and also helps us with speech along with that muscle movement. So the primary motor cortex is responsible for execution of movement, just the movement itself. And like we talked about, it is, it is in blue here, adjacent to the central sulcus. The way the motor cortex is set up is in a way that we call a homunculus. So if we look at this homunculus, and this is the top of the brain, what we see is in this motor cortex, the control of the bottom of the body is at the top of the brain. And then as we go down the motor cortex, what we're finding is we're going towards the top of the body. Now also notice that there's a very large area of the motor cortex that controls the hands, and then a very large area of the motor cortex that controls the face. And that's so that we have greater control of those areas, because obviously the hands need to be able to have great motor movement, and then there's a lot of facial expressions that go on. So as we talk about the motor cortex, we're going to have to talk about the premotor cortex, which is areas 6 and 8, and these help to generate intricate types of movement. So as we're talking about all these different areas of the body, let me just let you know that this type of muscular movement is very, very planned and detailed. And what I mean by that is the information doesn't just go from the brain to the body. The information goes to different areas of the brain and kind of bounces back and forth between the motor cortex and the thalamus and the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. And all of these different ways of communicating within the brain is making sure that we have good, fine, intricate muscle movement. And so the premotor cortex is really helping us out with all of that. And that would be like being able to pick something up, like picking up a fork or throwing a ball. That's what the premotor is involved in. Supplementary motor cortex, this is involved in performance of skills or skillful complex movements. And again, areas 6 and 8, which is this area right here. All right, so let's move on and talk about the basal ganglia. And so the basal ganglia is deep to the thalamus. And if you look here, you have the cortex, and then this is the corpus callosum here. And then you have, the corpus callosum right here, sorry about that. And then you have the thalamus right here. And here is the hippocampus along with the amygdala, and you also have the cerebellum. So the basal ganglia is deeper to all of this in the brain. Now, the basal ganglia is a group of, like I said, that deep subcortical nuclei. And if we're talking about the central nervous system, when we use the word nuclei, I want you to know that what that means is it is a group of cell bodies all coming together. So those cell bodies are the cell bodies that are part of our neurons. So you take all these cell bodies, you kind of group them all together, and imagine you have a whole bunch of neurons that you've taken a rubber band around the cell body and you tied them all together. And so that's what a nuclei is. And these nuclei are interrelated in our basal ganglia. They're going to help us to control this motor movement. They receive indirect input from the cerebellum as well as all of our sensory systems, including vision. And then they have a direct input from the motor cortex as well. So again, keep in mind that this motor movement is not simply the motor cortex saying, okay, send the information out the spinal cord, take it to the muscles, and let's get movement going. There's a lot of talking, a lot of chatter that's going on back and forth within the brain to make sure that this motor movement is very coordinated. So the basal ganglia also functions in organization of inherited and highly learned rather than automatic movement, okay? It also involves cognitive and perception functions. So the structure of the basal ganglia, we have what's called the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. And the globus pallidus is also made up of two sets of nuclei called the substantia nigra and the subthalamic nucleus. So if we're looking here, okay, you're looking right here. This is the thalamus, and then these are the ventricles here. And you have the caudate nucleus on each side here. There's two of these, and this is the same for each of these. This region is the putamen, and you have the globus pallidus, and then you have the subthalamic nucleus on each side and the substantia nigra on each side. And this is a cross-section of the brain, and we're looking at the thalamus here, and we have right here, you see that darker region. We know that that is the substantia nigra because nigra means darker or black, and you have other areas of the basal ganglia here and then right in here as well. So if you take the caudate and the putamen together, we refer to these as the striatum. And then the putamen and the globus pallidus together are referred to as the lentiform nucleus. And this is going to be all important terminology for you to know because as we go through these diseases, I'm going to be mentioning how the striatum or the substantia nigra or the globus pallidus is all involved. So as an overview of our motor system, you know that the cortex sends messages out. And one of the things the cortex does is send it out to the caudate and the putamen. And these act on the thalamus. Then we also send messages to the supplementary motor cortex, and that motor cortex, remember, it helps us with that fine motor skills, so it's helping us to review and edit what's going on. And then the primary motor cortex and the premotor cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex are all involved in this as well. And then the brainstem and the spinal cord finally get involved. The cerebellum also is going to ensure that movement is smooth. And what I mean by that is, you know, if you could close your eyes and touch your nose and then just take your hand away, you're doing this in one swift, smooth movement. But imagine if instead all that movement was very jerky. And so if that jerky movement is occurring, the cerebellum is not able to do its job appropriately. So the cerebellum, it's receiving ongoing information from the motor cortex, and its job is to run comparisons. And it's supposed to run these comparisons to figure out, okay, so where is this arm? Where is this muscle? Where is this joint? How do we get this movement going appropriate so that it is smooth movement? So this information is just constantly moving through the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is then altering input and sending that input to the brainstem and back to the motor cortex as well. So if the basal ganglia don't produce a functioning signal, movement is slowed or frozen, and this is what happens like in Parkinson's disease. And we'll also talk about how the cerebellum is involved in all of this. So here's just a picture of the cerebellum. This is a sagittal section, and if you remember, our cerebellum has that arbor vitae inside, that little tree of life going on. Here's the pons, the medulla oblongata, the spinal cord, midbrain, all going on up there. So we know the cerebellum is receiving this information from muscle contraction, and it's also receiving sensory information as well, so that comparisons can be made and decisions can be made, and the cerebellum can put these two together and then be able to send that information to the motor cortex, to the thalamus, in order to figure out what to do. Now, another term for you to know, and the cerebellum allows us to have this is called proprioception. Proprioception basically means that you know where your limbs are in space, okay? So again, imagine, or you could do it as we're talking, or listening to this video right now. Close your eyes and put your head back and take your finger and touch your nose. If your cerebellum is working appropriately, you should have no issues with this. Or if I were to ask you to walk a straight line, you should be able to do that. And the reason being is because you have the ability to know where your arms and legs are, even if your eyes are closed. If your cerebellum is impaired, so for instance, if you drank too much alcohol and now you're drunk, one of the things that cops ask you to do is when they pull you over and you're drunk driving, which I'm sure none of you would be, if a person other than you is drunk driving, the cop asks you to close your eyes, put your head back, and touch your nose. You're not able to do that. Another thing too is if you put your hands in front of you, palms up, and then you flip your hands palm down, palm up, palm down, palm up as fast as you can, you should be able to do that. But if your cerebellum is not working, you're not able to actually do that. So the cerebellum is very important in helping to control that information, that proprioception. This is just showing you, and I'm not asking you to memorize this, but it's just showing you how information is moving through the brain so that ultimately we can get muscles moving. So you have that premotor cortex sending information to the motor cortex, and now from the motor, notice all the different pathways that information is being sent. Now, typically, this pathway here doesn't occur very often, just from the motor cortex to motor neurons. Instead, what's happening is the basal ganglia is involved, cerebellum is involved, different areas of the brain are involved, and then we're sending information from the cerebellum, for instance, back up to the thalamus, from the basal ganglia to the thalamus, and also to the cerebellum, back up to the motor cortex. And all within here, there are systems where we go back and forth in order to make sure we have that fine motor control and that motor movement occurs appropriately. So again, basal ganglia, it monitors sensory information coming into the brain and sends it to the correct places to help also to be stored as memory. So you are learning, let's say, to play baseball. And obviously, learning is all about memory. And we have kind of sort of this almost muscle memory, but this is brain memory about how the body is moving. So how to swing a bat, how to catch a ball, how to keep your eye on the ball. You've probably heard all those types of things. So now when we have the basal ganglia working, it's going to be releasing certain neurotransmitters, and this is involved in particular pathways in the basal ganglia. So you have what's called a dopamine pathway, and this is from the substantia nigra to the striatum. So the neurotransmitter dopamine is being released. You also have what's called gamma aminobutyric acid. This pathway is from the striatum to the globus pallidus and the substantia nigra. Now, here's something else you probably haven't thought very much about. There are some areas of the brain where things are being stimulated constantly. And then what will have to happen is, in order for certain motor skills to occur, that stimulation actually has to be inhibited. We don't want excess stimulation occurring, because let's say if you have too much excess stimulation, for instance, you might end up having a tremor in that muscle. So we have to calm that stimulation down. And GABA is usually what we would call an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's typically released in order to calm stimulation or inhibit stimulation. The third pathway is an acetylcholine pathway, where these neurons are secreting this particular neurotransmitter, and it's important within the striatum. Now, we also have multiple general pathways, and in these pathways, you're releasing things like norepinephrine, serotonin, enkephalin, and there could be other neurotransmitters that are being released as well. So just keep in mind the dopamine, the GABA, the acetylcholine, and then we have just kind of this general pathway. And we'll talk about why that's important in these diseases. Now, the thalamus is a very important part of the brain as well. And it is kind of like a relay center. So the thalamus is very interesting. Anything that's going to the brain has to pass through the thalamus. Anything that's coming from the brain to the spinal cord has to pass through the thalamus. So basically what the thalamus is doing is, let's say as information is coming up the spinal cord through the brainstem, it hits the thalamus here. The thalamus makes the decision and says, okay, this information, you go this way. Other information coming up the spinal cord hits the thalamus, and the thalamus says, oh, okay, you need to go in this direction. So the thalamus is kind of like the police cop standing in the middle of the street saying, okay, you guys go this way, you turn this way, you guys go this way, you turn this way, and it's controlling information into and out of the brain. So the same thing, if information is coming from the brain and hits the thalamus, as it is going towards the spinal cord, the thalamus says which area of the spinal cord it's supposed to move down. So maybe it's supposed to move down through this lateral region here, or maybe the information is supposed to move down the spinal cord in the medial region. The thalamus is controlling all of this. So it's kind of like a switching station for the brain. I watched a video one time and I tried to find it so that you could watch it in this video, but it doesn't seem to be on the internet. And it was a woman who, she had very severe epilepsy, and of course this was done in the early 1950s, and the doctors decided in order to fix her epilepsy, they would remove her thalamus. Now, this is way before anyone had any idea what the thalamus was good for. And when they removed her thalamus, she had absolutely no control over her body, because the information coming from the body to the brain didn't know where to go. And the information coming from the brain to the body didn't know where to go. And so everything was jumbled and discoordinated. And unfortunately for this woman, she actually did not survive for very long. So the cerebral cortex is obviously interconnected with the thalamus, and if unmodulated, would cause hyperactivity, stiffness, rigidity, and continuous tremors. The basal ganglia modulates the thalamus and how excitatory it is by an inhibitory loop. So the thalamus is helping to excite particular areas of the brain. The basal ganglia is making sure the thalamus doesn't excite it too much using that GABA pathway. All right, so let's take a minute and talk about the brainstem. And you know that the brainstem consists of the midbrain, and then you have the pons, and you have the medulla oblongata. So the midbrain is associated with vision, hearing, motor control, your sleep-wake cycle, or what we call your circadian rhythms, how aroused or alert you are, and then temperature regulation. It's kind of funny because a lot of people think of the brainstem as just kind of there and not doing much, but it has a huge control over the body. It's what we used to refer to as your reptilian brain. And that's because if you look at reptiles, they're not super bright. They don't have a big cortex. Really, their brain is just like our brainstem. It's just this little tiny thing, and it controls your basic survival. The pons has nuclei that are going to interact with sleep, respiration, swallowing, bladder control, hearing and equilibrium, taste, eye movement, facial expressions, facial sensation, and even your posture. The medulla oblongata contains cardiac, respiratory, vomiting or emesis, and vasomotor centers. Is dealing with the autonomic and involuntary functions such as breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure. The spinal cord, so let's take a little bit of time and talk about it. It is made up of what we call white matter and gray matter. Now, the white matter pathways, these are going to be axons running up and down the spinal cord that are myelinated. And they're surrounded by gray matter, and I'll show you a picture in a second. And this equals the cell bodies with their synaptic connections. So the gray matter is in the center of the spinal cord. It kind of sort of looks like a butterfly. And this is really important. I want you to know anterior horn and posterior horn, okay? And what they control. So the anterior horn is a collection of motor neurons with related function. The posterior horn are sensory relay neurons, okay? So anterior motor, posterior sensory. All right, so let's look just a little bit about the anatomy here. So this is the dorsal region towards your back, ventral. This is anterior. So this would be the posterior horn. This would be the anterior horn. So you have 2, 1, 2 posterior horns, 1, 2 anterior horns, okay? So again, let's just go back. Anterior has to do with motor, posterior with sensory. So anterior, okay, this is our motor region, posterior sensory. Now, we could go through all of this, but I'm not really going to take a whole bunch of time. Just to say also that you have lateral regions here as well. So you have anterior, lateral, posterior, lateral. And remember, what's happening is you have these neurons with their axons running up and down the length of this spinal cord. And then in this gray matter, you have synapses that are occurring. So if you could think of, let's say, just this section of the spinal cord, and then imagine taking a really long piece of thread and pushing a needle all the way, let's say, through this lateral area here, and you have this long piece of thread sticking out of the top and out of the bottom of this section of the spinal cord, and these are going to be the axons that are running up and down your spinal cord, and you have millions of these axons running up and down. And then you also have areas of entrance where you have these sensory neurons that are coming in and synapsing. And then you have these areas of exit where you have the motor neurons that are synapsing and leaving. And so we'll talk more about all of that as we go along. So some of these long strands that are going up and down, these axons going up and down the spinal cord, are ascending pathways, which are sensory. The ones that are coming down are the descending pathways, which are motor. So with the ascending pathways, remember we talked about that lateral section in the white matter, you have what we call an anterolateral spinal thalamic tract. This is a group of axons in the anterior lateral portion of our spinal cord, and these are the spinal thalamic tract, okay? So these carry information of pain, temperature, and crude touch, and they're going to the thalamus, which is that relay station, and then the thalamus sends it to the sensory areas. Now, the first neuron, as it comes up through the spinal cord, is going to synapse in the dorsal horn. The second neuron crosses the spinal cord to the region ventral to the central canal, and then travels up that spinal thalamic tract to the thalamus. So basically what you have here is you have this, let's say, pain information that's coming into the spinal cord to go up to the brain. And what it's going to do is it's going to synapse in that dorsal horn area, okay? That dorsal region, they refer to this as a horn, and it crosses over. So you have this little tiny neuron here, it's called an interneuron, and it is going to take information, synapse here, and then go up to the thalamus. And notice how it's running in the anterolateral section of our spinal cord, and from the thalamus then on to the brain. So again, the first neuron synapses in the dorsal horn, the second neuron crosses the cord and travels in the spinal thalamic tract to the thalamus. And then these are just showing you other ascending pathways. And again, you have some kind of pain or thermoreceptor synapsing in the dorsal horn, moving across and then up to the thalamus and the primary somatosensory area of the cortex. Here you might have like proprioception, mechanoreceptors, and they're synapsing in the dorsal horn, but now they don't actually cross over until you get to the medulla oblongata. So different pathways do different things. So this is the spinal thalamic tract. This is what we call the lemniscal pathway. But they're both ascending. They're both sensory. So again, you have that lemniscal pathway, and it carries information from the skin of the lower and upper limbs and helps you to feel touch, vibrations. You can discriminate between stimuli and pressure. And then it carries information from your shoulders, your arms, your fingers on position and tension in your muscles and tendons for movement. Next, we're going to talk about descending or motor pathways. And the first one, the really big one, is the lateral corticospinal tract, or sometimes referred to as the pyramidal tract. This carries movement signals from the cerebral cortex to the motor neurons in the spinal cord. Crosses over in the medulla, travels down the cord in that lateral white matter. Passes into the gray matter in the cord to synapse with the motor neurons. So basically what you have here is you have the primary motor cortex, and then what's happening is we're going to the medulla where it's going to cross over, and you have the lateral corticospinal tract going down, and then what will happen is it's going to synapse in the anterior horn and leave into the muscle. And this is our motor neuron activating our muscle. You also have what are called the extrapyramidal pathways, And these are for movement of the trunk, movement of the proximal limb muscles, balance and posture, orienting sight or sound, and then a whole bunch more. And so you have several of these extrapyramidal tracts. And this just shows you that it is crossing over in the pons and coming down the medulla and synapsing in the anterior horn, and then coming out and synapsing with the muscle. So this is the cerebrospinal tract. Not that you need to memorize these, but I'm just showing you that there are other tracts besides our original pyramidal motor system. And again, originates in the motor cortex, controls all of our voluntary motor movements. And now, this is another thing. It consists of upper motor neurons, which are in the primary motor cortex, that's where they originate, and then the lower motor neurons coming from the anterior horn of the spinal cord. So we'll talk about both of those in a second because that's really important in these diseases we're going to talk about. The extrapyramidal motor system originates in the basal ganglia, which of course includes your substantia nigra, caudate, the putamen, globus pallidus, the thalamus, and subthalamic nucleus, and provides background for the crude motor movements. All right, so upper motor neurons versus lower motor neurons. The upper motor neurons are going to originate in the motor cortex, and they come down and then they synapse in the anterior horn, and these are considered the lower motor neurons. Now, lower motor neurons can come out through the brainstem, and then they can also come out through the spinal cord, okay? So keep in mind the lower motor neurons are the ones that are directly synapsing with muscle and causing muscle movement. Upper motor neurons are coming from the motor cortex and traveling down the spinal cord and then synapsing with lower motor neurons. So upper motor neurons project from the motor cortex to the brainstem or spinal cord, and they either directly or indirectly innervate the lower motor neurons, which then contract muscle. Motor unit. Now this is a motor neuron and all the muscle fibers that it innervates. Sensory feedback comes from the involved muscles. So there's continuously relayed information to the cerebellum and the basal ganglia and the sensory cortex, letting us know what's going on so that if we have to readjust information going out to the muscles, we can. So you have to have a functioning neuromuscular junction that allows your nervous system to communicate with the muscles so that contraction can occur. And you know that the neuromuscular junction is where that motor neuron, that lower motor neuron, is actually synapsing with the muscle. So we're going to start talking about the disorders and begin with the upper motor neuron disorders. And so lesions of upper motor neurons can involve the motor cortex and other brain structures through which the corticospinal tract descends, or even the spinal cord itself. So signs of upper motor neuron lesions would include paralysis or weakness of movement of the affected side, but gross movements may be produced as well. No muscle atrophy is seen initially, and then the person has what we call a Babinski sign. Now, a Babinski sign is where if you are going to take your toes and curl your toes downward, the big toe stays up and it curls kind of backwards. So children, little tiny babies that are first born, will have Babinski signs because their corticospinal tract is not fully functioning, which is one of the reasons why they can't walk until that spinal tract is able to function, or they can't control their hands very well, that type of thing. Another sign is loss of performance of fine motor skills, especially at the distal end of the limb, so the fingers type of thing. Superficial abdominal reflexes and then the cremaster muscle reflex are absent. And then spasticity or hypertonicity of the muscles. And then clasp knife reaction. So this is initial higher resistance to movement, which is followed by lesser resistance. So what happens is as the person initially tries to move, it's very difficult. And then as they continue to try to move, it becomes easier and easier. And then exaggerated deep tendon reflexes can occur. Disorder of lower motor neurons, lesions disrupt communication between the muscle and all neural input from the spinal cord and include the stretch reflex, which maintains muscle tone. All right, so signs of lower motor neuron lesions would be flaccid paralysis of the muscles, atrophy of muscles, loss of reflexes of muscles, and muscle fasciculation. So this is contraction of groups of muscle fibers, and this is due to irritation of the motor neuron. And you can see these fasciculations or these movements of the muscles. So the first disease that we're going to talk about is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as ALS. And this condition, most of the time in the United States, is referred to as Lou Gehrig's disease. And that's because Lou Gehrig, who was one of the greatest Yankees baseball players of all times, was diagnosed with this disease in 1939. And Lou Gehrig came out in the middle of Yankee Stadium during a game and made a huge announcement that he had this disease. And then he died as a very young man from it. And this is a form of motor neuron disease, and it's caused by degeneration of the upper and lower motor neurons. And this degeneration is occurring in the ventral horn of the spinal cord and eventually also occurring in the cortical neurons, so of the motor cortex as well. So ALS is a rapidly progressing disease. It begins with, or continues even with, weakness, muscle atrophy, spasticity, and dysphagia. And one of the big deals for the individual is they have this really hard time swallowing in the end, and many times this is what ends up killing the person. The early symptoms are the muscle weakness in the arms or the legs. They have twitching and slurred speech. And then death typically occurs within the first 2 to 3 years. There's respiratory compromise that happens. Sensory and cognition are not affected at all. And so what I've heard from people is that these individuals are losing motor function and they just become a shell of themselves, but they know everything that's going on around them and they can't communicate. They can't even allow you to know after a while that they understand what you're doing. So the defining feature of ALS is the death of both the upper and the lower motor neurons in the motor cortex of the brain, the brainstem, the spinal cord. So the lower motor neurons lead to denervation with subsequent shrinkage of the muscles, and the muscle fibers atrophy. And by the way, this is just a picture of Lou Gehrig in his prime. Upper motor neurons of the cerebral cortex are later affected in this disease. And lastly, the motor nuclei that are in the brainstem, particularly that hypoglossal nuclei helping with the tongue and the swallowing process, are affected. Another famous person with ALS was Stephen Hawking, who recently died. He was kind of different as far as a patient with ALS because he actually lived for quite a long time with this disease, and normally patients don't live that long. And so I'm going to show you a video about ALS and the hope of stem cell research with this disease.
The symptoms have progress where my left hand and arm are increasingly weaker, and my voice is starting to go, and some difficulty swallowing, that sort of thing.
The disease really is characterized by, for the most part, normal mental function and normal sensation. So patients gradually get weaker over time. It's not unlike stroke. It's not a disease that occurs overnight, but rather over a long duration.
What happens is the signaling mechanism for the motor neuron, the chemistry of that goes haywire, and then the motor neuron, which is the nerve that drives the muscle, starts kind of shorting out, and then that nerve dies and the muscle goes along with it.
You could go home pretty overwhelmed by kind of the gravity of it. That every patient you see is dying, and so that makes it a challenge to kind of being able to take a step back and being able to treat the patient, with respect and with enthusiasm, but at the same time realizing that it's a tough road for those patients.
I think from both scientific point of view and therapeutic point of view, stem cells is really exciting field to be in at this moment, because there are major breakthroughs happening almost every day in this field. It's very competitive, but it's also very fast moving.
Scientists are going full bore as fast as they can on this research, and now I think with the funding there and taking away the regulatory hurdles which existed for the last 8 years, I'm very optimistic about that.
For ALS therapy, using stem cell technologies is twofold. One is to use stem cells to replace the body's own sick or dying cells.
Cell replacement therapy. So for example, you are losing motor neurons in ALS, so we try to replace them.
And the strategy then is to really transplant those back into the spinal cord. So we need to identify what cell types are sick, replace those cells with our stem cell types, whether they be astrocytes or nerve cells, and then hope for neuroprotection in that setting. And the second strategy is really using stem cells to discover, really in the dish, what causes the disease.
Stem cells can give rise to cell types which are affected in human patients. So we can use them to study what's wrong in humans, why they get this disease. And we can also use these cells to screen for novel therapies, to test them in the dish. And then eventually we can go back to patient and in clinical trials to test whether these therapies we identified are effective or not.
Hung Jun really brings to the table all the understanding about how to push stem cells into different mature cell types, how to push them into astrocytes or how to push them into motor neurons. And then with our most recent collaborative project, how to turn skin cells back into cells from the brain, something we call neural stem cells.
You actually can turn the skin cells into cells with the stem cell properties. People call them induced pluripotent stem cells or iPS cells. So these cells actually has the potential almost like embryonic stem cells. So the potential of these cells in medicine, of course, is enormous.
I think the stem cell technologies offer so much with regard to therapy and with regard to understanding disease that I think it's a very viable approach, and we've only really scratched the surface as far as those opportunities.
They're getting close now. It will be for others to enjoy this benefit, so it's great.